If you're not healthy, maybe we need to take the pressure off producing for a while so that you can focus on healing and growing your roots so that you can be long-term sustainable.
Welcome to Permission Slips, a space for you to practice paying attention to your life with self-compassion and kindness so you can discover the wholeness, purpose, and joy you were made for. I'm Jillian DeBritz, a life and leadership coach and a recovering perfectionist, learning alongside you how to give myself permission to be human. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, artist and author, Bette Dickinson. Bette, thank you so much for joining me today.
Wow, Jillian, thank you. I appreciate such a warm welcome. It's a gift to be with you.
I'm so excited that we were able to connect. Our mutual friend, Kara, introduced us. She sent me your book, The Art of Winemaking, which we'll talk about, and just getting to know you through the words that you've written and the stories from your own life that you shared really makes me feel like we are kindred spirits. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm excited. I'm excited to know you more. But I want people to know a little bit more about your background and who you are. So let me
Sure.
just share your bio and then we'll jump into our conversation. So Bette Dickinson is a prophetic artist, writer, and speaker who invites audiences to connect with God through visual parables of the spiritual journey. In 2021, she founded Awakening the Soul, a ministry that creates resources and experiences to awaken the souls of ministry leaders through beauty and wonder. Bette's work integrates art, scripture, and spiritual practices that cultivate spaces of encounter with God. She's partnered with organizations such as Barna, World Vision, InterVarsity, Infinitum, and churches all over the world to guide leaders and communities into deeper spiritual formation through the lens of beauty. She holds a Master's of Divinity in Pastoral Studies from Grand Rapids Theological Seminary and is the author of Making Room in Advent, 25 Devotions for a Season of Wonder, as well as her most recent book, The Art of Winemaking. Bette lives in Traverse City, Michigan, with her husband and their 2 boys. Bette, you have done a lot. I'm so impressed. Like your bio, your resume speaks for itself. But
Well, bios, they're a little bit over the top sometimes and probably say more than they probably should. So I'll just leave it at that.
And it's helpful for us to have a context for who we're talking to. But I'd love to hear you talk about your story. Even just before we started recording, hearing a bit of your heart, and especially for leaders facing burnout and wanting to support them in their spiritual journey was so deeply personal for me. So I'd love for you to share a bit of your journey and how you got into the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I, for a long time, worked in ministry, in college ministry, and I felt this call somewhere along the way. Well, actually, it's always been there, but it's one of those things you just have to reawaken to throughout your journey, right? Is this sense that God kept reminding me that my truest self is an artist and that I needed to do ministry as an artist. And to try to figure that out has been a wild ride because there are not many people I know who do that. And I was on a prayer retreat once and sensed the Spirit say, I want you to integrate your painting and your writing and your speaking to create spaces for people to encounter me. And over the last several years, it's just been a process of unfolding what that looks like. And in many ways, I talk about that journey in the art of winemaking because what I learned from the vine coming into the learning, being a ministry leader myself and often experiencing burnout or sort of the pressure to produce, and even in the, especially in the ministry world, sort of produce external metrics of success in ministry really caused a lot of strain and stress on myself, but many others in the ministry world that I just felt there needed to be space created to learn a different way. And I think learning from the vine itself alongside rekindling my artist soul sort of intersected recognizing that to live a flourishing way in ministry meant tapping into who I was as an artist. And so I started this ministry primarily because I just felt I needed to find a way to do
Mm.
ministry as an artist, to create resources and experiences using my art and writing to help people encounter God on the right side of their brain, which we often disciple people on the
Mm.
left side of the brain with sort of words, analytical thinking, belief, scripture, all those good things, but really trying to figure out ways to give people an embodied encounter with God through being in the vineyard, through the
Mm.
imagination, through creativity, through all kinds of different ways of cultivating attachment with God.
Mhm.
And so that's how I kind of started the ministry and then have created a bunch of these works of art and writing and books and retreats and things like that to do that and to live out that
Yeah.
call in that way.
You have said so many things in that brief introduction that I wanna I wanna follow up on. And I'm gonna go first to what you said in the beginning, that you wanted to live out your identity as an artist.
Hmm.
What does that mean? Because as I'm thinking about people listening who are like, "Oh, well, I like to create," or I would never consider myself an artist, but maybe there is something about my identity that I don't know that I could be living out. Should I be living out? What does
Mm.
that mean to tap into who I'm created to be, which is one of my favorite things to help
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
discover. What is my God-given identity? Who am I uniquely in the world? So when you think about that for yourself, what was that journey like to be able to identify yourself as an artist?
Whoa. Well, there's a lot I could say. So I'll try to be brief, but I think, ultimately for me, I recognize that when I'm creating and I'm, especially when I'm painting, I find that I am the most connected with God and the most alive and the most myself.
Hmm.
And so I think everything needed to flow out from there. And I think what God began to show me was, your desire to create beauty is a part of who I've made you to be. I mean, that is who I've made you to be. And so you need to learn basically how to make that central and that everything should flow from out of that place. Everything should flow out of the place of our truest selves, hidden with Christ in God, and that's what that is. And I think, what I also write about this process in the art of winemaking because I think it took a lot of internal work to own that calling. Because
Yeah.
I think for a long time it was sort of trapped behind these walls of shame that said, actually, no, ministry is, discipleship, evangelism, it's programs, it's this or this or this forms of sort of boxes of ministry that I had been in that I felt like, well, this is the only way to do ministry is through these things. And I went to a retreat that Dr. Kurt Thompson led called Beauty and the Formation of the Soul. And that retreat just totally shifted everything for me because what he began to help me understand and the participants at this retreat understand is that actually beauty is one of the greatest tools that God uses to heal us and is the very place where we are seen, soothed, safe, and secure in the gaze of God, in the presence of God, that beauty actually creates that place of safety and belonging to encounter God himself. And that actually literally physiologically our brains heal when we encounter beauty. And so all of a sudden, when he began really unpacking these truths about what beauty does, it gave myself permission to say, actually, this is essential. Beauty is not
Hmm.
this external sort of thing that you just tack on for, convenience sake, but it's something that we're designed to flourish in. And that really helped me sort of kind of come out under the pressure of producing and ministry looking a certain way to begin experimenting and exploring with God what it could look like if I just
Hmm.
allowed myself to be an artist. And that actually what the world needs is not us to keep producing, but to subvert sort of the anxiety of the production way through unexpected beauty and encounters with God through that.
Wow. I love that word subvert. Like it's subversive. Beauty is subversive.
It is.
Yeah. Well, and especially in a metric driven world,
Mm,
which it's interesting for people outside of church culture or like even Christian culture, the word ministry may not be as clear. Like, what does that
sure.
mean when we talk about
Yeah.
ministry? And as someone whose husband has been in full time ministry for our entire marriage, I think about ministry as the work of letting the world know who God is, helping
Hmm.
people encounter God in practical, tangible ways.
Hmm.
And so it feels a little bit counterintuitive that we try to quantify the work of ministry,
Yes.
like
Yes.
to measure it. And yet, in the world that we're in, and you talk about this productivity driven culture, which I'd love to talk about, we do value output.
Hmm.
We measure success based on metrics that we can see and touch
Hmm.
and,
Hmm.
see that upward line of growth. And
Hmm.
that's not actually how God measures growth.
Mm.
And so for those of us in the ministry world who are trying to do work in alignment with God's heart in the world, it's a little bit confusing that
Yep.
we actually use this productivity driven
Hmm.
method of measuring our success. And so I hear you saying it took a supernatural encounter with God himself
Yep.
at this retreat, reminding me who I am, that I feel alive when I create. Like beauty in me, creating beauty in the world, seeing it in the world, creating beauty with my hands connects me with God like nothing else.
Hmm.
And that's important, just as important, if not more important, than the other measurable outcomes that the world values.
That's right.
I would love for you to talk about that, like the discrepancy between these two worldviews that you talk about in the art of winemaking. Can you kind of talk about that productivity value system versus the flourishing value system?
Yeah. Well, I really learned this from my friend Dave, the vine dresser, as I call him, because I had this encounter with him in the vineyard where I was working on a painting for and a written devotional piece on the pruned vine. And when I met with him, I I was trying to get source images of the painting, but I also wanted to talk to an actual vine dresser and learn about pruning and all those things that Jesus talks about in John 15. I asked him, what do vine dressers pay attention to when tending vines? And he said, actually, good vine dressers don't pay much attention to the fruit. I was like, what? He said that they pay attention to the health, the quality, and the vitality of the vine. And if you pay attention to those things, quality fruit will emerge, which for me, as somebody in ministry where my performance review at the time was measured by how many people were involved in the ministry, how many people came to faith in Jesus, how many small groups we had, those were sort of the quote unquote fruit that we were measuring. And it had this moment of epiphany for me and actually was what led me on this sort of 6-year journey learning from Dave and the vine was to see, oh, there's a different way of looking at the vine
Mhm.
than what I have understood from sort of this productivity driven approach. And I think, especially for Dave, because he is more of an organic farmer than sort of an industrial approach to farming, which is very
Mhm.
productivity driven. It's very much focused on quantity over quality. So
Mhm.
it's creating as many grapes as you possibly can and squeezing that out of the vine, right? As opposed to Dave, who really loves his vines and is very intentional to cultivate these vines to flourish over a long period of time. And so some of the things that I noticed about these two different worldviews were one, Dave's approach and the flourishing approach to our growth is very relational. It is
Mm.
incredibly relational, where Dave is getting in the vineyards 8 to 10 times during the growing season, feeling the leaves, looking to see where are there signs of health, where are there signs of disease, or how can he cultivate it towards health and flourishing
Yeah.
with a long view of the vine that says, I'm not concerned about fruit just for this year. I want you to be
Mhm.
able to thrive year after year after year after year. And
Wow.
what that means is if you're not healthy, I might actually need to take the fruit off the vine for a time so that you can focus on healing and growing your roots, which by golly,
Mhm.
if we could get that in the ministry world, right? Like if you're not
Mm.
healthy, maybe we need to take the pressure off producing for a while. And any kind of external sign of whether it's like whatever we want to measure the fruit by, maybe we need to take the pressure off measuring that for a while so that you can focus on healing and growing your roots so that you can be long-term sustainable. So I would say, quantity over quality is sort of the productivity driven approach, whereas the flourishing approach is interdependent too within the entire ecosystem of the vine. It's focusing on biodiversity and seeing diversity as a sign of health and flourishing and essential for flourishing, actually. It's recognizing the seasons and cycles of the vine, that the vine isn't always in harvest time, but there's this pattern of Jesus' sort of life, death, and resurrection that shows up in the vine, where you go into seasons of dormancy, of rest, of tending to the roots, of the work happening underground where you can't see it. And then how, in bud break, it's this expansive growth like resurrection. But even still there, the focus isn't on the fruit then either. It's the focus on growing and throwing out roots or throwing out branches and just trying some things. And then over time, it's the overflow of the cyclical seasons that lead to a culminating moment in the fruit at harvest. But it's just for a few short weeks. And if the vine doesn't, after harvest, sort of surrender the fruit and channel its energy back down into the roots, it will not yield fruit again. And so I think all of these things really just began to expand my mind to see, oh my goodness, we have, so many of us love John 15 in this passage of Jesus saying, I'm the true vine. But so many of us have been so disconnected from the land that we don't actually even know the context in which he was talking about these things and what Jesus would have had in mind when he was talking about the vine being abundantly fruitful, right? And even as you said earlier, the way Jesus looks at fruit isn't necessarily these external metrics of success. It's character change of who we are becoming as an overflow of abiding in the vine.
Wow. Right. And just to highlight this whole journey. So you went on a 6-year journey through the vineyard and walked with a vine dresser named Dave, who taught you intimately about the process of caring for, tending to the vines and the life cycle of the vines based on John 15 from the Bible, for people, again, that aren't familiar with this concept of the vine and the branches, where Jesus himself says, I am the true vine, and you are the branches attached to the vine. And my Father is the vine dresser. So he's the one caring for and tending to the health of you, the branches. He's the one responsible for the growth of the fruit. And so that's been such a meaningful passage for me to just really imagine and think about and contemplate for years, but even this specific year. And so it's really interesting timing for me to hear you talking about your journey. And I found myself, as I was reading the pages and you're describing the life cycle of the vine and the seasons of dormancy where you're going down deep, the roots are growing deep, and the energy is really channeled into the roots and healing, and the seasons where, growth is happening. And like you said, you're trying stuff. The branches are just growing before they get pruned back and redirected by the vine dresser to preserve their energy and put that energy into the direction the vine dresser wants those branches to grow so that they can be fruitful. But even that idea, like you just said, that sometimes for the health of the vine in the next year and the next year and the years to come, it means we give them a year of rest, that the vine dresser might cut off the fruit so that the energy can be preserved and go into the health of the vine and the growing of the roots. So I was just thinking, as I was reading, I was imagining myself and I was like, okay, Lord, what season am I in? Where am I at right now in the life cycle of the vine? Where am I as a leader? What is it that you're inviting me into in this season? Am I in a season of dormancy? Am I in a season where you're really pruning things back? It feels like it. And so I'd be curious about your journey as a leader and what you learned, maybe even the hard way, about why this work matters so much.
Yeah, well, goodness. I mean, I think what I started to see is that when I was living from a productivity driven approach, I had this view of God that he's like this boss that's just putting the squeeze on me for more fruit, and that I just needed to kind of keep meeting the expectations of, at the time, it was sort of showing up in whatever my supervisors needed from me, right? And
Yeah.
whatever the organization I served in, whatever they needed me to be to basically get to the end result that we were going for. And I found myself shape shifting. And so I'm an Enneagram 3. I don't know if you talk about the Enneagram at all on the podcast, but
A little bit.
it's an achiever. And achievers, they focus a lot on, what is shape shifting to be whatever version of success the situation calls for. And for me, it meant doing all of these things apart from like my creative self, because creativity is not very productive.
Ooh.
Beauty is not productive. It doesn't meet a bottom line. In most
Wow.
organizations, I was not asked to bring that part of myself to the surface because beauty is not efficient and it's hard to measure and it's hard to really fit within sort of the molds of what we really need is we need a
Yeah.
leader to do this, we need a leader to do that, we need somebody to direct this conference, somebody to meet with these students, these kinds of things. And my soul was dying
Mm.
because I kept trying to just fit this mold to appease the system that actually was not inviting me to be who I really was. And so I think the burnout for me just kept happening and trying to drum up the energy to produce when in reality the invitation was actually much more light and playful and beautiful to abide with Christ in the act of creating.
Hmm.
And I think even just paying attention to, when you get outside and you take a look at the way creation operates in not only the seasons of the cycles, but creation isn't like measuring the results of what it's accomplishing. I saw this really funny reel yesterday that was it was kind of mocking the idea of this guy was getting out in spring and he goes, "Oh, we're transitioning from Q1 to Q2, which means, the spring, the flowers are just really excited about really measuring what we're going to do in Q2 that's going to be better than Q1, and it's like this totally like ridiculous reel where this guy is just showing, and it's hilarious because the created world does not operate this way.
Yeah.
And I think we sometimes put an industrial view of what we've experienced in our own context onto God, that God is the one that's trying to put this pressure on us to have this sort of linear growth model, when in reality, he's saying, actually, no, I want you to flourish over the long haul. And it means cyclical rhythms and seasons and rest and joy and play and
Mm.
creativity and beauty that just looks very different than I think sometimes
Yeah.
we do. So
Yeah. And yet we operate within systems that are often based on this productivity model,
yeah.
right? We operate within a world where, we have to pay the bills,
Hmm.
right? Organizations have to be effective or you don't have a justification for the work that you're doing often,
Right.
depending on what
Sure.
we're talking about specifically. But so how do we live within a world that is industrial, that is productivity driven, with a heart that also values and honors and rhythms actually that value and honor this flourishing approach that tends to our soul, that makes space for creativity and play, that allows us to be ourselves, to operate out of our true identity? What are some ways that we can actually pursue flourishing within a culture that isn't set up for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think, one of the things that's helped me, and I think from what I've been hearing from people who've read the book, is that it's given them language to be able to articulate the differences in the two
Mm.
approaches, right? And when you can have a shared language, and, maybe in your work environment, you read the book together or whatever, and you're able to sort of see together, looking at the system you're in, where is this leading us towards health and
Yeah.
flourishing and, thriving, interdependence, biodiversity? Like, where are these things showing up? And can we celebrate those and lean in more to those? And then where is some of the productivity approach showing up in the ways that we view God or one another? How do we view each other from a transactional level where we're seeing our relationships on our teams or in leadership as, what can you do for me? As opposed to sort of beholding the wonder and the beauty of the person we're with and celebrating that and leaning into that relationship first over the output. I think thinking through what's our view of rest And
Mm,
what kind of boundaries have we set for ourselves and for one another to be able to thrive at our best instead of just getting the most out of people and burning them out, What's the
mm,
wake of the transactional productivity driven approach, like where, because that leaves behind a trail, right? It leaves
yeah.
bodies, it leaves
Mm,
carnage when we live this way. And so I think even looking at what's our retention,
mm,
are people staying in our organization because they love it and they're flourishing and they find a sense of belonging here? Or are we causing carnage that we just sort of like pop another person into this role and just keep moving
yeah.
along? And so I think, evaluating some of those things, having shared language and having conversations with people as much as possible, but then also assessing, where do I have agency for change? Within
Mm,
my own life, in terms of the rhythms that I set up, in terms of the boundaries that I set up, in terms of the way I view myself and the way I view other people, how can I view others through a flourishing approach of beholding them and wonder and celebrating who they are and their uniqueness and their gifts and their presence, or am I going into meetings just focused on the end results of what I want out of this meeting?
yeah.
And then I think even, if you're in leadership, it's assessing, well, where do I have agency to set a different culture?
Mm,
And I've been in organizations through a lot of this culture change where it takes a lot of prayer and it takes a community kind of coming together and saying, we're going to hold the line on these things. So we're going to pray, because I do believe that there's spiritual forces in the world that are trying to influence us towards this unhealthy approach. So it requires prayer. It requires accountability and community and support and shared language and dreaming together of how could we live a different way and what might that
mm,
look like. And then truly believing, if this is God's way, which I believe it is, because I think creation all around us shows us this is how God set things up to be. If this is God's approach, can we believe that it works?
mm,
And it might not show up in the timeline we're wanting, but can we trust that God has the long view and he's more concerned about the eternal value of what we're offering than this sort of year to year profitability and scale
yeah.
or growth approach?
Wow. If this is God's way, can we believe that it works? Wow. I mean, that I'm just thinking about the amount of courage and faith it takes to lead in this way, to lead in a way that prioritizes people over
Mm-hmm.
productivity and
Mm-hmm.
projects and deadlines and outcomes, and trusts that as we prioritize and invest in people and their health, that the outcomes will come. And
Mm-hmm.
even more, even if they don't come at the same level in the short term
Right.
as maybe pushing people, burning them out, maximizing their productivity, that we are retaining people, we're investing in people and allowing them to become more healthy, more whole, more themselves, and that in itself is valuable and worthy work.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking about how much courage it takes. Like, I feel that I can imagine myself as a leader. Like, I've been in spaces where I feel the tension of a deadline and I feel the reality of our limitations with time. Say we have a 2-hour meeting and we have stuff that needs to get done. And also, I want to check in with the people in the room. And that feels
Mm-hmm.
so inefficient. It
Mm-hmm.
feels so like I can almost feel my chest start to tighten and my heart start to pound. Where it's like, okay, be present, be present, be present. Like, it takes faith and effort and work to
Mm-hmm.
choose to go slow and invest in people over the outcome that feels so pressing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess I'm wondering for leaders, especially, if there are some more even practical ways that you can encourage them to maybe take one or two steps toward creating this type of a culture. If they're like, man, I see that my people are burning out, or I see that we're focusing more on metrics, on external metrics than internal health. What are one or two shifts that they could make first to help with this culture shift?
That's a good question. And I love breaking it down into that approach because actually, when I talked to Dave when he's trying to influence farming systems to be more
Hmm.
organic, say they have an industrial approach to everything, and rather than shifting everything all at once, he says, "What's one change you can make this year to
Yeah.
the farm system that will
Hmm.
create more health?" Maybe it's, not using fertilizer and using compost instead, or so I think, yeah, in terms of leadership, I would say, one or two different steps that you could take would be, I think, rest and how you're honoring rest and
Mm-hmm.
boundaries with work is a really big one in our culture. And so what does vacation look like for your people? What does a sabbatical look like? Could you even trust giving a sabbatical to some of your team and trust that there will be good things that they will bring back to, your organization or ministry as a result? I think, things like making sure you have good boundaries even for what you're asking and how you're communicating to people when they're off work. Are you sending
Hmm.
them text messages and emails
Mm.
after 5 o'clock?
Wow.
Are you modeling that you actually don't honor your own rest by how you're communicating with people? And are you expecting them to respond within that
Mm.
time? So I think, thinking through how are we setting the culture around rest and boundaries with that? And then I think also rather than thinking about how you measure things by numerical goals is thinking through, are we evaluating our culture
Hmm.
in terms of how it's set up to help thrive, and finding maybe more qualitative measurements of success than quantitative, which is hard because it's
What would that
hard to
look like?
measure. Yeah.
Right. What do you mean by that?
I think, if you were to do an end of the year evaluation, basically,
Hmm.
of, each person gives feedback on the organization and ask some questions around, do I feel like I can belong here in my
Hmm.
gifts and calling as a woman, as a person of color, as a, like whatever, especially paying attention to minority groups and whether or not they feel a sense of safety and belonging. Asking, is this the kind of culture where I feel like I can bring my full self to the
Hmm.
table? Do I feel celebrated in who I am? Do I feel like I want to be here with the people that, because it's the people that draws me here? It's the vision of what flourishing can look like in the community here as opposed to just measuring our outputs. And I think a really good book actually with this, I talk about it in The Art of Winemaking, is Rare Leadership by Marcus
Hmm.
Warner and Jim Wilder, because they talk about this from the lens of leading from two different sides of your brain. And
Hmm.
so they say that, leaders who measure things primarily by results and a productivity driven approach, they lead from the left side of the brain, which is the management side of the brain, which is, analytical thinking. It's assessing and trying to remove problems. They said that actually the more powerful side of the brain when it comes to leadership is the right side, because it's relational attachment. It's the sense of identity that you create and sense of safety that you create in the work environment. And there's a lot of good, beautiful models for this that I talk about in the book. Obviously, Jesus, who he was not concerned about external results, right? He was deeply
Right.
invested in the character and the formation of his disciples, and that was a primary focus. And what they say is the difference between sort of results driven leadership or identity driven leadership is that when you're focused on who are we and what is it like us to act and how do we support one another and collaborate and have a community of thriving, is that actually people who come into that work environment, they do their best work and
Hmm.
actually perform better because they're not, they're fulfilled. And so it's just this overflow of their best selves as opposed to always feeling like they're striving towards something that they could never actually reach.
Right.
So they have some good suggestions in that book as well when it comes to
Mm.
leadership, especially.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. I'll be sure to link that in the show notes as well as your books, and we'll talk about some other opportunities you have to support people in this work. But I want to acknowledge the reality that to lead in this way takes, again, so much effort, so much
Hmm.
courage, and it's impossible to lead people into a place of greater health than the leader is actually
Yeah,
experiencing
that's right.
themselves.
Yep.
And as a leadership coach, I really believe in this idea that healthy people make healthy leaders.
Mhm.
And so,
Mhm.
what does it look like for a leader to tend to their own roots, to tend to their own soul, so that they can pour into and tend to the people that they're leading? And so, my question around leaders who find themselves in a place of burnout, they don't want their
Mm.
people to burn out, but what
Mhm.
if they're in that place of like, I don't know what it even means to care for myself right now because I'm so stretched so thin or I'm so depleted, running on fumes. The demands are so much. What would you say to a leader who is in that place where they don't even know how to tend to their own soul so that they can help support the souls of those they lead?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one is just being able to have the vulnerability to name that to the
Mm,
people in your world is the first step.
yeah.
Name it to yourself, to name it to God,
Yeah.
to name it to your community, because that's where people can step in and help and say,
Mm,
when you say, like, I am on the verge of burnout, or maybe I am burnt out, is there something we can do to shift things so that I can get to a place of health for not just my sake, but for the sake of those I'm leading, and
yeah.
really begin those conversations. And what would that look like? And it looks different for everybody in every organization, I think is one step. And I think that that's, again, looking at where do I have agency to make some of those decisions in my schedule of actually taking a real Sabbath day off, or actually choosing to for a season to invest more in my own health than the outputs, and that can look like a lot of different things. That's also why I started this ministry, is to really give
Hmm.
these spaces for ministry leaders, especially to come away, to go on a retreat, to encounter God on the right side of their brain through their bodies,
Yeah.
through creativity, through listening to a vine dresser talk about flourishing and seeing God through that lens that he
Yeah.
cares for us.
Yeah.
Those experiences can be very transformative, just to be able
Hmm.
to be in that space and not to have to do it all your own, but then go through a community experience afterwards with these cohorts where you have other leaders that are learning alongside of you together of how do we live a flourishing life in our own community and, in our own lives, but then how do we lead people
Hmm.
into flourishing? So you can't do it alone. You have to do it in community. And then I think
Yes.
also just giving space to come away and carving out some time to learn and be
Yeah.
intentional. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you named the vulnerability
Yeah.
of admitting, yeah, I'm struggling. I'm
Yeah.
on the edge of burnout. Something has to change. Like that takes such, again, courage and humility to be able to name that, to be willing to
Mhm.
name that. And
Mhm.
because the temptation, the pressure as a leader is to keep going
Yeah.
and to not let anyone see what feels like weakness in
Yeah.
your human limitations,
Mhm.
but is actually a strength to
That's
offer
right.
to others that this is, I need support. And I love that you named, we cannot do this alone.
Mhm.
And you and I share an appreciation for the work of Dr. Kurt Thompson and the way he especially talks about vulnerable community being the key to our
Mhm.
flourishing.
Mhm.
I love that you offer this kind of support for people practically for ministry leaders, especially. Can you talk about some of the cohorts and the retreats and things that you offer if people want to do this work and they're like, I don't know where to start? What are some of the ways that you might be able to walk with them?
Yeah. So the Art of Winemaking Journey is this year-long program where it starts with a retreat in the vineyard with other ministry leaders, especially, is what it's designed for. And then we follow a cohort model where we meet for these intensives to go through the book and the online courses that go with the book that are embodied spiritual practices, their teachings of Dave and I in the vineyard, and their activation exercises to kind of help work some of these things out. But then we meet together online to debrief in a small group to pray for one another. And so the next one is happening in Sonoma in May. And so our deadline is April 15th. If you get this, you're like, I want to go,
Amazing.
you should sign up.
Yes. Yes.
And
That's
that
so
one's
soon.
for, especially for women and
Hmm.
women leaders, but it's open to any woman seeking rest or renewal. But then the
Hmm.
one in October in Traverse City will be coming up not too far away. And then honestly, if you're not able to go to a retreat, we'll also have like online cohorts that you can join, and you can do the course material on your own or read the book on your own as well. But the
Hmm.
journey is really what I would recommend if you really want to lean in and allow this to
Yeah.
seep deeply into your life and
Yeah.
transformation.
Well, and I'll just say from personal experience, as I have been on this journey of learning what it looks like to live and work at a sustainable pace, in a sustainable rhythm, in a way that
Mhm.
allows me to flourish and become myself, as opposed to allowing myself to get used up and spit out,
Yep.
even by myself, my own
Right.
expectations of my
Yep.
pace and productivity.
Yep.
That community has been the crux. That's
Mhm.
been the game changer for me, and
Mhm.
continues to be what supports me and helps me pay attention to how I'm living, and to have people speak into my life and say, Jillian, you're allowed to rest. What would it look like? How can we help you rest? How can we support you in that this week? So yeah, I just want to highlight that as well. And I'll make sure to link information about your retreats and cohorts in the show notes. But before we wrap up, Betty, is there a permission slip that you would want to give to the people listening?
Yeah, I would say permission to be in what season you're in and to
Hmm.
not try to be in any other season. That if you're in a dormant season, it's okay to be in a dormant season. If you're in a pruning season, it's okay to be in a pruning season. And one season is not better than the other. They're all essential to the flourishing of the vine. And so just giving
Hmm.
yourself a little bit of a lift to say, I have permission to rest. I have
Yeah.
permission to tend to my roots. And that's
Yeah.
actually for the long-term health and thriving of myself and the people that I
Yeah.
lead.
What if you're in a season you don't want to be in? What would you say to those people?
Well,
I'm asking for a friend.
it doesn't last forever. So
Yeah.
that's the thing about every season is, right, it's just a
Yeah.
season. So if you're in a season of pruning or dormancy and you're like, I want out,
Yeah.
it will eventually shift, but you also have to be willing to do the work that season
Yeah.
requires, and I think sometimes God keeps us in a season of dormancy until we can let it do the work in us that it needs to do. So,
So good. And you talk a
yeah,
lot about surrender.
that's right. I was
Surrender
just
to the
going to say, you have to
process and to the
surrender.
vine. Yes, it's so good. Well, for people that are interested, the art of winemaking is just a really rich resource for this journey, and to learn about Betty and her journey has been really inspiring. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for the good work you're doing in the world. This has been a gift.
Oh, thanks, Jillian. It's been a gift to me too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Permission Slips podcast. I hope this conversation gave you permission to consider what it might look like for you to tend to the roots and health of your own soul. If you're looking for support on that journey, please do check out Betty's cohorts and other resources. And you might even consider what it might look like to invite someone to walk with you one-on-one, whether it's a spiritual director or a coach. I do have a couple of spots left this spring for one-on-one coaching, so you can check out more information about that in the show notes. Remember, your life matters, and so does your flourishing, more than you know.